I didn't notice the day my son stopped calling me. If someone asked me when it happened, I wouldn't be able to answer them. There wasn't a last phone call that felt different. There wasn't a disagreement, or a silence that followed something important. There wasn't even a moment when I remember thinking, this is the beginning of something changing. It just happened quietly. And the truth is, for a long time, I didn't even realize it had happened at all. I only noticed later, when I caught myself looking at my phone more often than I used to, without really knowing why. My son used to call me all the time. Not for anything serious. Not because he needed something. Just to talk. Sometimes he called while he was driving home from work. Sometimes when he was standing in line at the grocery store. Once, I remember, he called me just to ask if I thought it was going to rain the next day, even though he could have checked that himself in a second. But that was how our conversations worked. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that don't seem important until they stop happening. I still remember when he was little. He was the kind of child who always wanted to tell me what he was thinking, even when his thoughts didn't make much sense yet. He followed me around the house when he was 4 or 5 years old, asking questions I didn't always have answers for. Why is the sky lighter in the morning than at night? Why do dogs bark at some people but not others? Why does toast smell different than bread? Sometimes I answered him carefully. Sometimes I guessed. Sometimes I told him I didn't know. But he never stopped asking. Even when he grew older, that didn't change as much as I thought it would. There are parents who say their children become quiet teenagers overnight. That wasn't him. He still talked. Not always about everything. But enough that I never felt like I was outside his world. When he was in middle school, he used to sit at the kitchen table after dinner long after everyone else had finished eating. He would stay there, leaning back in his chair, telling me things about his day in pieces that didn't always follow each other. A teacher who said something strange. A friend who changed seats in class. A project he didn't want to start but eventually did. At the time, I didn't think those conversations meant anything unusual. I thought that was just what families did. We talked. We listened. We stayed close without needing to explain why. Even in high school, when his life began moving faster than mine in ways I could see but couldn't fully follow, he still called from time to time. Sometimes he called from a friend's house. Sometimes after practice. Sometimes late in the evening when I was already getting ready for bed. "Did I wake you?" he would ask. "No," I always answered. Even when he had. Because hearing his voice never felt like something I wanted to miss. When he left for college, I expected things to change. Everyone told me they would. "You'll hear from him less," people said. "That's normal. He's building his own life now." And I believed them. At first, though, he called more than I expected. The first few weeks especially. He called to tell me about his classes. About the cafeteria food. About a roommate who stayed up too late and snored louder than anyone should. He even called once just to tell me he had finally figured out where the laundry room was. We laughed about that longer than the story probably deserved. Those calls became part of my routine without me noticing when that happened. I began to expect them. Not in a demanding way. Just in the same quiet way you expect the kettle to whistle or the evening news to start at the same time every day. He called most Sundays. Sometimes earlier. Sometimes later. Sometimes just for a few minutes. But he called. Years passed. College ended. He started working. His life filled with responsibilities I understood but no longer shared. Still, he called. Not every day. Not even every week sometimes. But often enough that I never wondered whether he would. There was always a rhythm to it. A connection that didn't need to be scheduled. Then one afternoon, I realized I hadn't heard from him in a while. Not long enough to worry. Just long enough to notice. I remember exactly where I was when I first thought about it. I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing a plate after lunch. The window above the sink was open slightly. I could hear someone mowing the lawn somewhere down the street. It was an ordinary afternoon. The kind of afternoon that doesn't usually stay in your memory. But I remember thinking, it's been a few days. That thought surprised me. Not because a few days mattered. Because I had noticed them at all. I dried my hands slowly and looked at my phone on the counter. There was no reason he should have called. Nothing had happened. Nothing was wrong. Still, I picked it up. Not to call him. Just to look at it. That was the first time I realized I was waiting without knowing I had been waiting. I didn't call him that day. Or the next one. I told myself what every parent tells themselves. He's busy. He's working. He has his own routines now. That's how life works. And it does. It really does. But something about that small pause stayed with me longer than I expected. A few evenings later, I found myself cooking dinner for one. That wasn't unusual anymore. It had been years since the house was full every night. Still, I set the table the same way I always had. Plate. Glass. Napkin folded carefully beside the fork. Some habits stay with you longer than the reasons you started them. I sat down and began eating slowly. Halfway through the meal, I reached for my phone without thinking. Not because it rang. Because I thought it might. That surprised me. I put the phone back down again almost immediately. I didn't want to become someone who waited for calls that might not come. That thought felt unfamiliar. I had never waited for him before. He had always called. Later that week, I decided to call him myself. Not because I needed anything. Just because it had been long enough that it felt natural to reach out. He answered quickly. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I answered. For a second neither of us spoke. Not because there was nothing to say. Because we were both adjusting to something small that neither of us mentioned. "I was just checking in," I said. "Oh good," he replied. "I've been meaning to call." He sounded sincere. And I believed him. We talked for a few minutes. About work. About the weather. About something he was planning to fix in his apartment. It felt normal. Comfortable. The same as always. When we said goodbye, he added, "I'll call you later this week." "Of course," I said. I didn't think about that sentence again right away. But later didn't come that week. Or the week after. And I still didn't think of it as something important. Not at first. Life has a way of stretching time differently when you get older. Days move quickly. Weeks move quietly. Sometimes you don't notice how much time has passed until something reminds you. For me, it was a Sunday afternoon. He had called on Sundays for years. Not every Sunday. But enough that the day carried a small expectation with it. That afternoon I finished my coffee and sat in the living room longer than usual. The television was on, but I wasn't really watching it. Every so often I glanced toward the table where my phone was lying. Not directly. Just in the way you look at something without admitting that you're looking for it. Evening came. The light outside the windows softened. Cars passed along the street the same way they always did. The phone didn't ring. I didn't think of that as a problem. Not yet. Just as something I noticed. The next Sunday felt the same. And the Sunday after that. Still, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to become the kind of parent who counted calls. That didn't feel like the right way to understand what was happening. So I told myself again what I had told myself before. He's busy. He's building his life. This is what growing up looks like. And I believe that. I still do. But one evening not long after that, I was standing in the hallway outside his old room. I don't know why I stopped there. Maybe I had been walking past without thinking. Maybe I had been remembering something without realizing it. The door was open. The room looked the same in ways that surprised me. Some books still on the shelf. A jacket hanging on the back of the chair. A few things he hadn't taken when he moved out. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed the way I used to when he was younger and didn't want to fall asleep right away. Back then he would talk to me from under the blanket about things that didn't seem important enough to remember. And somehow I remembered all of them anyway. I sat there longer than I expected to, listening to the quiet in a room that had once been full of questions. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think something I hadn't quite admitted yet. It wasn't that he was busy. It wasn't that he had forgotten. Something else was changing. Not suddenly. Not loudly. Just slowly enough that I had almost missed it. After that evening in his room, I began to notice the silence differently. It wasn't heavier. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply clearer. Before that, I had explained the change to myself in practical ways. Work schedules. Responsibilities. The ordinary movement of adult life. Those explanations were still true. I didn't stop believing them. But they no longer explained everything. I remember the next morning very clearly. It was early. The kind of early that used to belong only to school mornings when the house filled with footsteps before the sun had fully risen. I still wake up around the same time, even though there's no longer any reason to. Some habits stay with you longer than you expect. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window while the kettle cooled behind me. The street outside looked the same as it always had. The same trees. The same sidewalks. The same houses where other families were beginning their days in ways I could almost imagine without seeing them. For a moment, I thought about calling him. Not because anything was wrong. Just because I had been thinking about him. My hand even reached for the phone before I stopped myself. It wasn't hesitation exactly. It was something quieter than that. It was the realization that I didn't know if he would be available. Years ago, that thought wouldn't have crossed my mind. I would have called. He would have answered or called back later. The connection between us didn't need to be scheduled then. Now it felt different. Not distant. Just arranged around things I couldn't see. So I put the phone down again. That small decision stayed with me longer than I expected it to. Later that week, I went to the grocery store. It was the same store I had been going to for years. The aisles were arranged the same way. The bakery smelled the same. Even the woman who worked at the register near the entrance still recognized me and nodded when I walked past. I bought more food than I needed. I didn't realize I was doing it until I reached the checkout. It's a strange thing to admit, but I still shopped the way I did when the house was full. 3 apples instead of 1. A loaf of bread that takes longer to finish now. Soup I used to make because he liked it when he came home late. I stood in the parking lot afterward with the bags in my hands, and wondered how long I had been doing that without noticing. When I got home, I put everything away slowly. I paused for a moment when I reached the shelf where I used to keep his favorite cereal. It had been years since he lived there. Still, I had bought it again. I didn't even remember putting it in the cart. That evening I decided to call him. Not because I felt lonely. Not because I was worried. Just because it felt like the right thing to do. The phone rang longer than usual. Not long enough to concern me. Just long enough to notice. When he answered, his voice sounded slightly distracted. "Hi," he said quickly. "Hi," I answered. "Did I catch you at a bad time?" No. It's okay. I'm just finishing something." We talked for a few minutes. About small things. Weather. Work. Something he had been planning to fix in his apartment. The conversation moved easily the way our conversations always had. But there was something else there too. A kind of carefulness I couldn't quite name. At one point I almost asked him when he might be visiting next. The question reached the edge of my thoughts before I stopped it. Instead, I said something simpler. "It's good hearing your voice." He laughed softly. "Yeah. It's good talking to you too." When we said goodbye, he told me he had to get back to what he was doing. "I'll call you this weekend," he added. "Of course," I said again. I didn't think about that promise right away. Not until the weekend passed quietly. On Saturday morning I cleaned the kitchen the way I always do. Slowly. Carefully. Without thinking about what I was doing. At some point I found myself wiping the counter near the phone more than once. I didn't notice that until afterward. On Sunday afternoon, I sat in the living room with a book open in my lap. I read the same page 3 times without finishing it. Not because I wasn't interested. Because part of me was listening. Waiting without admitting that I was waiting. The phone didn't ring that day. Or the next one. Or the day after that. I didn't call him again. Not because I didn't want to. Because I didn't want to become someone who called too often. That thought surprised me. There had been a time when I never measured how often we spoke. Now I found myself thinking about it in ways I never had before. A few evenings later, I walked past his old room again. This time I didn't stop right away. But I slowed down. That was enough. I pushed the door open and stood there for a moment. The light coming through the window was softer than it used to be at that time of day. Or maybe I only noticed it differently now. I sat on the edge of the bed again. The same place I had sat years earlier when he was small and didn't want to fall asleep until he finished telling me everything he had been thinking about. Back then he used to talk about things that seemed small. A test he was worried about. A friend who said something strange. A game he wanted to play the next day. He never seemed to worry about whether those things were important enough to say. He simply said them. And I listened. Now the room held those memories quietly. Without needing to explain them. I stayed there longer than I meant to. Thinking about how many evenings we had spent talking like that without either of us realizing how rare those moments would become later. The next morning I made breakfast earlier than usual. I don't know why. Maybe I had woken up with more energy. Maybe I had simply returned to an old habit without noticing. I made eggs. Toast. Coffee. Too much food for one person. I sat at the table looking at the extra plate across from me before putting it back in the cupboard. I didn't feel sad when I did that. Just aware. Aware of how easily habits stay with you even after the reasons for them change. That afternoon I received a message from him. Just a short one. Busy week. Hope you're doing well. I smiled when I read it. Not because of what it said. Because of what it meant. He was thinking about me. Even if he didn't have time to talk. I wrote back. Everything's fine here. Take care of yourself. I almost added something else. Something longer. Something I couldn't quite name. Instead, I left it there. Later that evening I sat by the window as the light outside slowly disappeared. I watched people walking past the house. Neighbors carrying groceries. Someone walking a dog that stopped every few steps for no reason I could see. Life moving forward in small ordinary ways. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I hadn't wanted to ask before. Not why he had stopped calling. Not whether something was wrong. But something quieter than that. Something harder to explain. When had our conversations stopped being part of our routine, and become something we had to make time for? That question stayed with me longer than I expected it to. Not because it worried me. Because it changed the way I began noticing things. There had been a time when hearing his voice was part of the structure of my week in the same quiet way mornings belonged to coffee and evenings belonged to turning off the lights in the kitchen before going upstairs. I never counted those calls. I never waited for them in a deliberate way. They simply arrived, the way familiar things do when they've always been there. Now I understood something had shifted. Not suddenly. Not painfully. Just clearly enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. A few days after that evening by the window, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. I drove past the park where he used to ride his bicycle when he was young. It wasn't planned. I had been running errands nearby and turned onto the street almost without thinking about it. The trees along the sidewalk were taller than I remembered. The fence had been repainted. The benches looked newer. Still, I recognized the place immediately. There are places that stay part of your life even after you stop going to them. I parked the car for a moment, and watched a boy riding in slow circles near the edge of the grass. His father walked behind him, not too close, not too far away, the way parents do when they want to be nearby without interrupting. I remembered the first time my son rode his bicycle without holding onto my arm. He had looked back 3 times in less than a minute. Not because he was afraid. Because he wanted to make sure I was still there. I had been. I always was. I stayed in the car longer than I meant to. Thinking about how natural it had felt then to be needed in such small ways. Helping with shoelaces. Carrying school projects that were too big for his hands. Standing at the door in the evenings when he came home from somewhere he wasn't quite ready to describe yet but wanted to tell me about anyway. Those moments didn't feel important at the time. They felt ordinary. But ordinary things become important later in ways you can't predict. On the way home I stopped at the grocery store again. Not because I needed anything. Because I was used to stopping there on Wednesdays. Routine stays with you long after the reason for it changes. I walked past the cereal aisle without thinking and reached automatically for the same box I used to buy when he still lived at home. Halfway through the motion I stopped. Looked at it for a second. And put it back. Not because it made me sad. Because I finally understood I didn't need to keep doing things the same way they had always been done. That realization was quieter than I expected it to be. But it stayed with me. That evening I made dinner earlier than usual. I set one plate on the table. Only one. For the first time, it didn't feel like I was removing something that used to be there. It felt like I was noticing what was already true. After dinner I sat in the living room without turning on the television. The house was quiet again. But the quiet didn't feel unfamiliar anymore. It felt settled. A few days later my phone rang in the afternoon. His name appeared on the screen the way it always had. I answered immediately. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I answered. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he laughed softly. "I realized I haven't called you in a while." There was no apology in his voice. Just honesty. "I know," I said. "I've been meaning to," he continued. "Things have just been busy lately." "I understand," I told him. And I did. We talked longer that day than we had in weeks. About work. About a trip he was planning. About something he was trying to fix in his apartment that sounded more complicated than it probably was. The conversation felt familiar again. Comfortable. Not exactly the way it used to be. But still ours. Before we ended the call, he said something that stayed with me afterward. "I always think about calling," he said. "Sometimes I just run out of time before the day ends." "I know," I told him again. And I did. When the call ended, I didn't sit looking at the phone the way I had a few weeks earlier. I didn't wonder when he would call again. I didn't measure how long it had been since the last conversation. Instead, I thought about something I hadn't understood clearly before. Children don't stop calling because they stop caring. They stop calling the same way they stop looking back when they ride their bicycle for the first time without help. Because they've learned how to move forward on their own. That realization didn't feel like loss. It felt like recognition. Later that week I walked past his old room again. This time I didn't stop in the doorway. I kept walking. Not because the room didn't matter anymore. Because the memories inside it didn't need to be visited the same way they had before. They were already part of me. A few evenings later he sent me a message about something small. A problem with his car. A question about a recipe he remembered from years ago. Something ordinary. Something simple. I answered the way I always had. Without thinking about whether the conversation would continue or stop there. Because I finally understood something I hadn't known how to say to myself earlier. Our connection hadn't disappeared. It had changed its shape. There had been a time when I was part of the middle of his days. Now I was part of the edges of them. Still there. Still present. Just differently. One Sunday afternoon not long after that, I made coffee and carried it to the table near the window. The light outside looked the same as it always had. Neighbors walked past the house. Someone across the street waved. Life moved in the same quiet rhythm it always does when you stop expecting it to stay the same forever. My phone was on the table beside me. I didn't look at it. Not because I didn't care whether it rang. Because I no longer needed it to. For the first time in a long time, I understood something clearly. My son hadn't stopped calling me without a reason. He had simply begun living the life I had spent years helping him learn how to build. And somehow, without noticing when it happened, I had begun learning how to live mine too.